Hello and welcome to our webinar, Clever Ways to Unlock More Value in Your Organization's Data. I'm Paul Mearsman, the Head of Marketing at CDS, and I'm delighted to have you all with us today. CDS is a professional services agency that enables strategic change. We partner with an ecosystem of leading technologies to help large and complex clients get the most value out of them across four key areas: cloud and infrastructure, operational transformation, experience transformation, and business process outsourcing. We have an exciting agenda lined up for you. We'll explore how data can accelerate the speed of change within your organization and home in on the importance of enterprise data architecture and its implications for your system design. Another crucial aspect we'll be addressing is decision making. It's not just about making decisions, it's about making data-driven decisions and capturing the insights from those decisions to assess their impacts. True data-driven decision-making goes beyond intuition and includes examining the data around the quality of those decisions. This approach provides invaluable insights that influence future choices. To help us delve deeper into these fascinating topics, I want to introduce our expert speaker for today, Geoff Barraclough. Geoff brings a wealth of knowledge and experience accumulated over his 20-year career in various data-driven domains such as healthcare, logistics, finance, and property and leisure. His expertise has led to measurable and sustainable changes in data usage, resulting in improved business outcomes for numerous organizations. So please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Geoff Barraclough. Geoff, we are eagerly looking forward to your insightful presentation.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Thanks, Paul, for the intro. The focus of today is looking at a few of maybe the less common ways you might start adding value or finding value in your data. We'll be covering off data governance, and there's quite a big section on that. But we're also going to be touching on metadata and on decision making. So first of all, I'm going to start by giving an overview of each of the areas, talk about some of the ways that we can impact data value or the ability to articulate value to drive investment. Then I'll try and provide some tips and pointers for being able to start working in these areas, and we'll start with data governance. Data governance, I believe, has got to be one of the most misunderstood, underutilized business value drivers out there. We have to ask ourselves why this is. And to my mind, the single greatest problem with data governance is how we sell it. Most businesses, the approach to data governance is predicated on risk. It's a really natural place to start, but the issue with focusing on risk is that people have a natural tendency to employ the minimum effort that they can to mitigate a risk to an acceptable level. This is even more the case if the risk is perceived as a shared risk, not a purely owned one. As a result of this, data governance often becomes a tick box exercise, and it really fails to deliver what it needs to do in providing value to an organisation. We often seem to confuse data governance with data quality. We're only looking at it through that lens. So let's talk about how we might reframe data governance. Next slide, please, Paul. So the way I look at it is that data governance is a framework, and it's a set of processes that enhance the value of your data. And please notice that I've not used the word protect, because that implies a diminishment of some form of maximum value state that can't be exceeded, and risk doesn't really appear at all. That's not to say that risk doesn't have its place. It absolutely does. We need to be conscious of it. But you'll naturally reduce risk if you improve or enhance the value of your data. It doesn't need to be a driving force, I think is what I'm saying. Next slide, please, Paul. So spending money on data governance shouldn't be really seen as a cost that you use to mitigate risk, but an investment to drive value. And if you can look at it through that lens, it changes the perception really quite fundamentally. Psychologically, people are far more likely to expend effort to generate value than they are to try and minimize risk. So what is the value of data governance? I think everyone will jump to data quality as the answer that comes first, and yeah, rightly so. There are loads of estimates about the cost of poor data quality, somewhere between 15 to 30% of an organization's revenue. IBM put somewhere in the region of $3 trillion in the US around the cost of data quality. So it's an obvious area to try and utilize when making a case for investment, but it is a little nebulous. It's hard to fully quantify. So what I say is, let's not limit ourselves to data quality. My focus today is on looking at an area that is often not looked at, which is on time to value and improving the change process. Now, I've been on a lot of change boards and I've been involved in a lot of changes. And what I see time and time again is this. Most changes undertaken by a company involve data in some respect. If you exclude infrastructure or networking changes, almost every change involves data in some way or another. When we get to the data element of a change, we often lose momentum that we've gained. It's often not the technical implementation of a change that causes a delay. We lose momentum due to issues around data governance because we don't know, where's the data? How do I access it? Should I access it? And once I've got hold of it, how might I interpret it? How do I know what it means? By the time we've resolved these issues, it can have added weeks to a change. The worst thing is, once we've found out these things, we tend to forget them, or we rely on organisational memory for future changes in this area. The ability to update our knowledge and keep it fresh and available to people very often doesn't exist. And it's particularly relevant, I think, when we're looking at legacy systems, lots of point-to-point integrations, and the inability to enable change at pace. It can really cripple an organisation. It's often hard to identify the true costs associated with this. So I've come up with a formula to try and put this into practice. Now, what I've done is taken some baseline information and added some multipliers to take account of some of the less tangible impacts of slow change. Next slide, please, Paul. So this is the basic formula I use, and at a high level, we have got the value of a change, the impact of the delay, and the addition of the resource cost in terms of dealing with that data issue and the extra time it takes to deal with it. So our value of change is our number of changes per year multiplied by the annual value of the change. And I've got a 1.5 multiplier in here to take account of the fact that the higher the number of changes or the value of changes, the more important changes to your business. If you're a business performing lots of changes every week or every month, then clearly change is an important value driver for your business. And without it, you're losing certainly some less tangible aspects of value above and beyond the material impact of financial change. The delay impact is simply the average amount of time we lose to investigating data issues and dividing that by 260 number of working days in a year on average. So we get an annual impact of that, and the resource cost changes per year, time taken to mitigate the data issues, times a day rate, and 0.5 multiplier here because people won't spend their time on that single issue. So trying to mitigate the fact that we've not got someone working necessarily full time on this. What I'm now going to do is just run through a quick example of what those numbers add up to. So Paul, if you can push on to the next slide, please. You can agree or disagree with the numbers, but you can use the formula yourself to figure out what it means to you. And actually, the number of changes and the value of change isn't really the most important thing here. In this instance, I've got 50 changes in a year, so roughly one a week, average value of £20,000. You might think that's a bit high, you might think it's a little low, depends on the size of the organisation and what you're doing really. But if you think that you may have at least a couple of changes worth maybe 6 figures to an organisation, then an average value of change at around the 20k level may not be too high. Our delay impact here is 28 days, so an addition of an average 4 weeks on change because of poor data governance. And what that gives us is an output that tells us that on a an estimated value of 1.5 million in the year for change, we would actually lose or not gain 442k of it. As I said, the numbers themselves are just working through. The key thing that comes out repeatedly on these numbers is the percentage. So however you figure it in terms of the value of your change, in this instance, you're losing nearly a third of that value due to delays caused by poor data governance. So that's some pretty chunky numbers in there. But where are we right now in time? Is there an organisation out there that isn't interested in leveraging AI for a significant advantage to their company? And I think we probably all recognise that AI is absolutely entwined with data. You can't really take advantage of AI without utilising data. So using this formula, what could the impact be on a single project that has a really significant benefit to the organisation? Paul, if you want to push on to the next slide. So in this instance, our number of changes is 1. The value of our change is significant. I've gone for 500,000 in this instance. The delay impact is increased from previously because it's a complex data element. We're looking at utilising AI. It's more likely to be more complex data issues that we need to resolve. And the day rate I've pushed up as well because we may be looking at some quite specialist resource that we're looking for here. So even on this one singular piece of work, we might lose something like 24% of the value of it in a year just because we had poor data governance. So these are the kind of figures that we can utilise when trying to make the case for data governance investment and adding those to any numbers that we have for data quality as well. But now more than ever, it's really imperative that organisations employ data governance to their advantage. Identifying the value of it rather than focusing on risk is going to be key to gaining investment, and really more importantly, the buy-in from the rest of the organisation to make it successful. And being able to articulate the value of the speed of change on top of data quality really will be key to this. The next area I'm going to touch on is metadata. Paul, if you'll spin on, thank you. Metadata, in its simplest term, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is data that describes data. One for us data geeks out here. It's typically not used for operational activity, and as a result, it rarely gets the attention it really deserves. It's used most commonly for analysis, and as such, there's often a level of tension between the analytical teams who want to be able to add value to the business and the operators who are driven maybe by efficiency measures and resist the overhead of maintaining additional information. I guess referencing back to my previous point about the change process, however, metadata is really crucial for organisational analytics, particularly in order to be able to identify where change might be required or where you might be wanting to invest your change effort and cost. Some common areas of valuable metadata. There might be an extension of categories or hierarchies to provide more segmented or targeted analysis. Things like extending your geographical understanding. So rather than just saying that people might live in England, Scotland or Wales, can we break that down into counties or regions or cities? So we can look at where we have greater sales uptake or increased cost of distribution as an example. Extended demographics. Simply being able to group the age ranges of your customers can lead to insightful information to help your marketing teams or to understand where your buying patterns might lie. Adding these into geographical analysis as well just adds an extra layer of understanding and helps really target where you want to try and make change in the organisation. Other areas that we might look at might be time-based overlays. So things like, to make sense of trended or time-bound information, things like seasonality. Coding, holding information about the seasonality of your business. Does it have an explosion of sales in the summer and a reduction in the winter? Is it linked to certain events within the year? or even just as simple as being able to understand financial periods and financial years in relation to trended information. Last area we could look at in terms of metadata would be targets or expectations, the ability to hold information about the average process times that things take or efficiency rates that we're looking to achieve, mean that you can provide information, allow people to understand what good looks like rather than just comparing to themselves. The area that I'm going to focus on today, though, is the particularly overlooked aspect of metadata, which is the event timeline. What do I mean by an event timeline? I'm referring to the ability to record, report on, understand the impact of significant events. Things like new product launches, maybe the removal of a particular service line, the loss of a significant customer, or simply a week where flu hit the operation particularly hard. Now, in searching for areas where change should occur, one of the most common methods is trend analysis, year-on-year comparisons. Within these analytical sets particularly, we often see anomalies, unexpected peaks or troughs that seem to indicate a problem. Hours, days are then spent on analysis, only for someone to go, yeah, that's when such and such thing happened. Don't worry about it. You know, there was some event that occurred that's causing that anomaly. It's not a problem that we need to recognise and deal with. The majority of organisations will rely on what you might call organisational memory to deal with this. You know, they have people around who remember the key events, but that's predicated on people remembering events. Not everyone remembers everything that happens, and also then being around to provide advice. This can waste a lot of analytical time and resource, not to mention being particularly demotivating for an analyst that's put time and effort into trying to understand something that in the end wasn't anything to understand. In the worst case example, no one remembers the event, change can be put in place which wasn't needed, costing time and effort for no reward. So in this example, from a previous company that I worked for, we had a lot of patients who were on a particular brand of medicine. It went off patent, and there was a huge drive to move patients to an unbranded or generic version of the product. This provided cost reduction to the NHS and had actually a beneficial impact on our margin. So when looked through the eyes of the financials, it was fine to see the natural pattern that was shown. However, when we were seeking to look at the efficacy of the drug, how well it worked for patients, it looked on first instance like there might be a major problem. Lots of patients moving off this particular medicine at an early stage in their condition. And clearly this wasn't actually the case, and the only reason for the change was due to some financial incentives for the hospitals. By identifying this and creating metadata to group some services together, we could show the true impact on patient numbers and mitigate concerns over the efficacy of medicine within our analytics. So in the example here, the top left chart shows data as it appeared naturally within our systems. Obviously, the numbers are slightly made up, they're not real numbers, but they are indicative of what was happening over a particular time period. In this instance, we didn't have a company timeline. We were relying on organisational memory to do it, but we identified the event. If we didn't have people there who remembered what was going on, or time had moved on, say to now, for example, several years later, maybe people would be trying to analyse this data and trying to understand what was happening. If you have a company timeline, you can identify the event. You can create metadata to allow the analytics to be able to manage it and simplify the outcome, as in the bottom chart, by grouping together the three services as a homogeneous group and looking at the analytics of the new metadata-driven group rather than the pure operational data. So by creating a company timeline, you can remove the reliance on organisational memory, and where significant, you can actually implement models to manage the impact of the event. Move on to the next slide, please, Paul. Final area I'm going to talk about is decision making, and linked to that being data driven. So what organisation doesn't want to be data driven in this day and age? But what is it? What does it actually mean? I hear the phrase bandied around all the time, but rarely do I hear people define it. So a simple definition might be it's using good quality data, it's accurate, it's timely, it's complete, provided to the right person at the right time, so make a good decision. Yeah. Possibly. I don't think that goes far enough though. Just being provided with good information isn't a guarantee that a decision is going to be good. It makes a positive impact. This is assuming that people are robots or they have the same level of experience, they can make consistent decisions irrespective of environment or experience. It's just not the case. Move on the slide, please, Paul. But in reality, being data-driven as an input doesn't actually guarantee you an output. Making good decisions that benefit the business is the output. And I think we probably want to focus on the output, don't we? So how might we go about determining whether decisions have positive impacts? They might look beneficial in the short term, but they might have longer term implications. History is littered with initiatives that seemed positive at the time, but then had longer term negative consequences. Decision may also be positive for one aspect of an organisation, but negative to another. So what we really need to start looking at doing is recording the decision making itself in order to determine the impact of the decision, both over time and the organisation as a whole. Most importantly, we need a mechanism to provide the impact of previous decisions to be used as part of the next decision making process. And it is a process. Decision is not a singular event suspended in time and context. Decision making is a process in its own right, and it really deserves to be treated as such. Move on, please, Paul. So this diagram, I think, is a very basic example of what you might call the decision making process. So in the first instance, we identify a problem and we say, okay, I've got a problem. What data do I need? Well, there's a decision point right there. What data do I need? How do I know I'm using the right information to solve the problem in the first place? Secondly, does the data or report exist? If no, we request it, we get the data provided, we review the data. If yes, we go straight to review data. Once we've reviewed the information, do we need more information? Do I have enough to satisfy myself that I understand the problem and I understand what I can do in order to mitigate the problem? If I don't need more data, I can decide on the course of action. If I do need more data, we go back in the loop to what data do I need? So there's a decision point 2, do I need more information? Have I got enough? And a decision point 3, which is my course of action. So hopefully it's really clear. Decision making is a process in its own right. Being presented with a dashboard is not decision making. It's identifying the problem. It's figuring out what data I need to solve the problem. It's getting hold of the information, analysing it, interrogating it, figuring out what impacts that might have, trying to understand if I need more information, and then finally, after all of that, coming to a decision on my course of action, which is my decision point 3. This isn't bad, right? This is a nice structured approach, but it doesn't tell you anything about whether the decisions that are being made are good, whether they are positive, whether they provide positive impact to the business. Can you move on the slide, Paul? So, for me, this is what data-driven is really about. In the first instance, record the first decision about what data do I need. Are people actually able to use the information that they need? Do they have access to the information that they need? Being able to understand what information is being used to make a decision is a key part of understanding what the impact and what the outcome of that decision is likely to be. And we go through the loop, recording the decision about whether more data is needed. So did they have everything they needed up front? Did they need to go more? Did they need to request that information, or was it freely available? And then at the end, record that decision. If you record that decision, you can then calculate the impact of it. We can generate lots of nice models to understand what's happening within the business to different service lines to P&Ls, from a financial perspective, from an operational perspective, from a capacity perspective, from an SLA to customer perspective. We can look through all these different lenses to be able to understand and come to a conclusion about what the impact of that decision was. We can then use that for feedback purposes. Once we've got that information and started gathering that over a period of time, we can generate knowledge and understanding about the decision-making process itself. So we can ask people, if you're looking to identify a problem, hey, we've had this problem identified X number of times previously. And by the way, when you're looking for the data that you need, some people asked for this set of information, some people looked at that set of information. The people that looked at the second set of information, the impact of their decisions was significantly better or worse than the people who looked at the first set of information. So we can help guide, in the first instance, the set of data that is most useful for generating the best outcome. And as we get to the end, the course of action, again, we can say, we've had this problem identified previously. Here's what people have decided to do, and here was the impact of those decisions. That's not to say people need to take the same decision time and again, because the environment, the event, the circumstance around what they're deciding may be different. But it's giving them the understanding of the likely impact of their decision up front so they can make an informed decision based on previous understanding. So that feedback loop for me is the most important bit about being data driven, is giving people context about previous impacts to help them determine what their next step should be. Now, hopefully I haven't waffled on too long. If you want to move the next slide along, Paul, I can spend a little bit of time providing some tips on how you might be able to move forward in some of these areas. Next slide, please, Paul. The first thing we'll talk about is building the case for investment in data governance. So most important thing I would say is incorporate all three elements that I've spoken about today. Make sure you talk about data quality, make sure you talk about speed of change, make sure you talk about data security. And I'd probably put them in that order as well. I certainly wouldn't start with data security. Puts people off. Frankly, it makes people yawn. Most people aren't that interested in it. They'll say they are. In reality, though, they don't see the benefits themselves, so it'll become a tick box exercise. Lead with your value drivers. And in data quality, I think the easiest examples to cite and to gain evidence for are things that have happened. So you can look at marketing, you can see the how much cost it's done, how many things you've done, what the outcome of that has been. So you can evidence some of the cost benefit ratio around it. And process, again, it's things that have happened, so you can work out what the cost benefit is to it. Other areas of interest that you might want to look at but harder to quantify might be poor or delayed decision making or missed sales opportunities. Now, these are harder to quantify because they're gaps, they're things that haven't happened. So the best you can do is really estimate or use some research to put some estimates around that. And that's why looking at the speed of change element is really important, because it adds on to your data quality value and adds another layer of value into your business case for investment in data governance. As we went through, the simple steps of this are identify the volume and impact of change on the organisation, look at the complexity of your data elements and assess what your average delay time is. I'd have thought this should be quite straightforward when you go back through your change log. You see how long various different projects take to complete. And that will allow you to calculate a financial impact of a slow speed of change. Within data security, do include it, but understand that any financials you put to it are a guide to risk. They don't have an impact on your value proposition. And try not to over-egg the risk. That always puts people off. Review your potential exposure, moderate the tone. You know, if you are a highly B2C organisation, lots of individual people's data, you're taking payments and things like that, clearly it needs to be quite a big deal. If you're more B2B, or you don't necessarily take lots of payment details from people, you know, have a realistic approach to what your risk around data security is. Move on to the next slide, please, Paul. Again, with data governance, I'd always advocate start with a relatively lightweight approach. I think the following 4 areas can be done in under 10 weeks if you put some focus on it. I'd always start with the data maturity assessment. Identify where you are as a business. It's got 2 real benefits. One, you can focus on your gaps, get yourself up to a consistent line where you're maximizing where you are, and be realistic about what you can achieve as well. All maturity scales and data governance and data strategies are around maturity scales. They all say the same thing. You've got to go through the steps to move forwards. You can't jump ahead. You've got to have learned from the pain to be able to gain the buy-in to move forwards. So don't shoot too far ahead. Try and create really small steps that generate benefit, but don't try and jump too far. Make sure you've got a data quality framework. Make sure you've got a data governance framework to work within. To assist that, really useful tool that I found is conceptually modeling the business. So this isn't getting down into the nitty-gritty of the business. This is identifying really key generic areas that you might link together. And that's where you should look to enable ownership. Really important that ownership isn't too granular. It cause lots of headaches, lots of discussions, death by committee. Ownership needs to be at quite a high level and needs to be driven by senior people within the organisation. And to get them to drive it, can't focus on benefits for them. So using the previous approach where we've look at speed of change, look at time lost, look at the impacts of data quality, and articulate why it is of benefit for them to become a data owner in a particular area. Finally, do the basics. I classify this as what, where, who, and why. So a data dictionary is a key thing. Provide your what, your definition, your classification, a data lineage map. Where is the data? How is it linked to other bits of information? And a data access policy. Who, why? Who can use it? Why can they use it? For what purpose? For all of those things, though, don't try and do everything. So don't try and commit to providing a data dictionary and lineage and an access policy for every single element of data within your organisation. Start on key areas and expand it out over time once you've got the buy-in and people see the value of doing it. Last step on this, which isn't written down, but which is really, really important, is the iteration and completeness of these products. So when you go through change, link this into your change process. When change happens, make sure your data dictionary gets updated, make sure your data lineage gets updated, review whether the data access policy needs to be updated. It's a really useful thing to put in the change process control, a tick box that says, have these things been done? And if they haven't been done, you can't progress with the change. You can create some really simple gates which force these things to be completed over time. Move on, please, Paul. Some tips around metadata. I'd focus on operational improvements and sales enablement. They're the areas that generally have the biggest value gains to be had. Geospatial enhancements are always going to be beneficial. Process targets and SLAs, as I've touched on previously. In terms of a how people might groan, I don't think there's anything wrong with storing it in a structured format in Excel. I'm sorry, but analytics teams, they're not immune from managing data. You might want the business to do it, but when you're trying to get buy-in, when you're trying to work at those early stages, I think it's worth considering whether it's something you take on yourself. Ideally, you want it to be something that doesn't change quickly, so you don't have a high burden on the updates. But Excel can be consumed into any modern BI tool and joined to other analytical data sets. So you don't have to go really complicated straight off the bat. You can get there, you can build it out over time, but you don't need to start with a platinum solution, I guess is what I'm saying. Once it's embedded in decision making, once you've got the buy-in, then build out better data governance about it. Ideally, put it into core systems, but the downside of doing it there is they take a long time to change potentially. So consider some process automation tools to help you manage that. Move on, please, Paul. This slide, very simple example of an implementation of a timeline into a dashboard. So a very simple dashboard, we have a time slicer, we have a chart. Against the chart, filtered by the time slicer, we have the events that have occurred within the company timeline. And we can see that there's 3 events here that relate to time periods to help us understand what is going on. If you can implement tags within your dashboarding, that's even better, because you can then highlight the key events or filter things out. So if you tag this particular dashboard with patients, for example, or onboarding, then we could easily then accommodate a filtering of the timeline to show only those elements that might have an impact to it. Next slide, please, Paul. Decision making. Capture decisions on what data is needed to solve problems. An approach to this: identify heavily used items, ask the users what business problems they're trying to solve with that, capture these problem statements, so generate metadata about what problem statements are being solved by what reports, and then also gather some information about what other data they think would be helpful, and use that to guide some priority on where you develop your data sets and reports. On the actual process itself, once you have that kind of metadata, you can start doing some simple things, like where you have metadata around what data is used to solve what problem. You can give that to someone as a static dashboard. Now, when someone's looking at what problem I want to solve, here's a dashboard that says, here's a list of problems, filter for those, here's a list of reports and data sets you might want to consider using in the first instance. Use spreadsheets to log the data. Find 1 person, 2 people who are willing to work with you to write down the decisions that they've been taking. Perform some ad hoc analytics to identify the outcomes and impacts. Add those into the dashboard so that not only can you then provide to someone information about what information is used to solve a problem, but what kind of impacts come as a result of that. And then over time, look to get buy-in from a more automated approach. Move on, please, Paul. Couple of thoughts on this as a whole. I think if you're considering how to go about digital transformation, you need to consider your enterprise architecture and its impact on data. Digital transformation relies on good data quality, it relies on speed of change, and it relies on reducing your total cost of ownership. I spent a lot of time working with business systems and business processes, understanding requirements of systems to work with data. As one simple conclusion I've come to, and that is trying to satisfy process complexity and the need for change within system records is insane. They should be allowed to be specialists in what they do. An enterprise architecture that accepts this and is designed to allow you to connect applications through a process layer allows you to approach your digital transformation in an agile, iterative manner, focusing on areas that provide value first. I'm not alone in thinking this. Microsoft and Salesforce, for example, heavily pushing their low-code platforms to be used in conjunction with their core systems. They know that massively customized systems of record create bad data, increase complexity, and reduce the ability to change. We've also got process automation tools that sit on their own. So if you don't have a D365 or a Salesforce implementation, you've got tools such as Appian or Pega or ServiceNow, which can combine all your systems together, improve your data quality, and create that process layer that reduces the complexity in your underlying systems. I'm not saying there's a magical panacea to everything, but if we're looking through the lens of data quality, data governance, automation-based efficiencies, these process automation and low-code platforms provide so much value in that area. It really should be on your radar when you're considering where your next steps are. I just want to thank you for your time.